accepted the responsibility to protect.
On atrocity prevention.
Words kill.
All societies are potentially vulnerable.
Atrocity crimes.
Timely and appropriate action.
Welcome to Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention by the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. I'm Jacqueline Streitfeld-Hall, Research Director at the Global Center. This podcast features one-on-one conversations with practitioners from the fields of human rights, conflict prevention, and atrocity prevention. These conversations will give us a glimpse of the personal and professional side of how practitioners approach human rights protection and atrocity prevention, allowing us to explore challenges, identify best practices, and share lessons learned on how we can protect populations more effectively. Today I am joined by Horia Mosadiq, an Afghan and woman human rights defender, a journalist, and director of Conflict Analysis Network. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, for inviting me.
Horia, it's been 1 year since the Taliban militarily took over Afghanistan. Could you set the stage for our listeners? What happened last August and what has been the general situation in the year since?
I can't really believe that, it is just the anniversary of Taliban retaking of Afghanistan. And it has been like 1 year. Of course, Taliban did not take over Afghanistan militarily, but they took it part of a compromise and agreement made between the US and our president and his allies. So this has been, unfortunately, the deal where Afghanistan was handed over to the Taliban rather than Taliban being able to take it militarily. And the issue with, in the past 1 year, I think this has been the most difficult 1 year, since I have started my activism. Of course, this is the second time that Taliban have taken over Afghanistan. But I think this time it affected us so much, and it has affected us at so many levels, from personal to professional to, all sorts of levels. And this has been because, in the past 1 year, we all have invested so much in Afghanistan. We all have paid such a high price with our personal life, with our blood, and then suddenly we saw everything just given and handed over to the Taliban. So in the past 1 year, it has been extremely difficult for all of us. It has been every day we wake up with the reports of Taliban, killed someone, executed someone, taken women to prison, disappearances, and so many other atrocities and human rights violations that is happening all over the place. Women are deprived of their very basic fundamental rights, such as access to work, access to education. And unfortunately, this has become our daily occurrence for the past 1 year. Every day we wake up, there is no day goes by that we do not receive a report that whether Taliban have summarily executed someone, or some people have disappeared, or some people were abducted and taken into detention, or women are being killed or disappeared, or being beaten up, and their human rights have been violated on a daily basis. And unfortunately, this has been our 1 year since Taliban took over.
The situation you've just described in terms of restrictions on women's rights and attacks against civilians, I know that a lot of this has particularly targeted civil society actors, including women's rights activists, human rights defenders, as well as reporters. How do you think this has affected human rights monitoring and reporting that comes from within Afghanistan?
It did affect significantly. First of all, we are dealing with a de facto authority that they do not abiding with any form of law or legal framework. Simply, in Afghanistan, we have an absence of a legal framework. And according to the Taliban, they are implementing Sharia, but then the interpretation of Sharia is different from person to person, from village to village, from district to district. And with that, like the other problem that we are facing for the past 1 year, when all the atrocities and human rights violations that are happening, there is zero accountability, because Taliban, who were once, killing, assassinating, attacking human rights defenders, journalists, and civil society activists, they are right now in charge of the government. Who do we go and complain to? In the past 1 year, like tens of human rights defenders and civil society activists were arrested, disappeared, abducted, killed. And this has been the same situation with journalists. Freedom of expression, which was one of our greatest achievement post 2001 in Afghanistan, it doesn't exist anymore. Journalists are simply being, detained and tortured for inviting in their talk show a Taliban critic. People who are daring to criticize Taliban's policy, or women who are protesting on the streets, or men who are objecting to what is happening in the country, they all face severe punishment by the Taliban. And those punishment is from abduction, disappearances, detention, and unlawful detention without due diligence, and disappearances, to also assassination. Some of the people are getting killed by unidentified gunmen, and no one knows who they are, and you have no way of holding the perpetrators to account. And this simply because the legal framework and the protection mechanism that we had before, it doesn't exist anymore. Like, simply, we are just left to fend for ourselves. And if you're lucky enough to survive, we would. And this has been also one of the main reasons that so many human rights activists and journalists, they had to flee the country, because after they're being attacked, threatened, and some of them that were detained, they had to sign a document and guarantee the Taliban that they will not speak against the Taliban, and if they speak, then their family can face the consequences. So this has been our situation for the past 1 year. Like, the freedom of expression is at its lowest level since Taliban took over. And if you compare it with what was happening before that, women rights, human rights, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and political, social, and economic rights, everything is, it whether doesn't exist or it's at the lowest level.
You just mentioned specifically women's rights, and I know that that's one of the things that had significantly changed in the time period when the Taliban didn't have leadership. But now that they're back in power, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has characterized the steps they've taken as institutionalized, systematic oppression of women. Can you describe some of the recent restrictions they've placed on women in particular, and the impact that has had on people?
Well, yeah, like in the past few months, Taliban not only, they refused to open schools for the girls, and they refused to allow women to go back to their offices and continue to their work. They also imposed restrictions on movement. So women are not allowed to leave their home without being accompanied by a male chaperone, or women are not allowed to travel certain distance without a male accompany. and also head to toe covering in burqa or in other forms of like it's called hijab by the Taliban have been imposed on women. Uh, Also, most recently, Taliban announced that women who were part of the government, part of the civil servants, they should introduce a male relative to come and replace them in the government. So, with all that, like what it really reminds us, like back in 1990s when Taliban were in charge of the government in Afghanistan, we knew that they are the only gender apartheid regime in the world. We knew that they are the most anti-woman group in the world. And we kept warning. We kept warning the US, we kept warning the West, we kept warning the United Nations, but unfortunately no one believed us. And they always spoke to us about like-minded Taliban have changed, and Taliban are not the same as they were in 1990s. And we kept telling them, yes, we know that they are not the same Taliban as they were in 1990s, because they became more vicious, they became more violent, and they also learned how to play diplomacy. They learned a lot how to trick and how to lie, how to lie bluntly and not being held to account. But I believe that the international community, they wanted to believe what Taliban are telling them. They wanted to not believe us, and they didn't want to listen to us because they wanted Taliban to return. They wanted Taliban to be part of the, whatever so-called peace solution they wanted. This is what they were really doing. So, and 1 year after, I think many of the Western diplomats or UN officials, as an Afghan woman, I think honestly they're just shedding crocodile tears. This is, like they knew what will come with the Taliban. They knew how Taliban will be and how Taliban are looking like. But they just wanted to sell this idea of like-minded Taliban, or Taliban have changed and this and that, to their own people and also to their own governments, while we all knew what will come with it. So this has been the situation. Like, this is not just about women's rights and girls' rights to education, to employment, and to political participation, but then you see at this systematic discrimination against other ethnic groups across Afghanistan, the persecution of religious minorities, the persecution of other ethnic groups in Afghanistan. Like, you have a cabinet of all male from one ethnic group, like women and people from other ethnic groups are totally being sidelined. And the worst is that, like right now, the atrocities that are happening in Panjshir, in Andarab, in Daikundi, in Balkh province, it is not getting highlighted in international media. And if you look at the level of atrocities that you're committing in these places, and then if you look at the level of atrocities they're also committing in Pashtun dominated area, particularly against former members of the Afghan National Security Forces, former members of the Afghan government, against women, against girls, and they're not being reported simply because people are so scared to report. And unfortunately, you barely hear that in the international or local media. And people who dare to report, they face severe consequences for that.
Thank you for that. I think you've touched on this a bit, but how have threats to minority groups, such as the Hazara, for example, changed since the Taliban took over? Have targeted attacks against them escalated? I know that the persecution has escalated, but what other threats and atrocities are they facing?
Well, it is not just Hazaras, but also Hindus. Unfortunately, the last members of the Hindu community, they left Afghanistan a couple of weeks ago. because Afghanistan turned into a hell for them. They have been attacked in their places of worship. They have been attacked in the streets. They have been attacked, and their properties have been confiscated, and they experience so much atrocities. And we also know the background that back in 1990s, how Taliban treated Hazaras and Hindus. And this has been exactly the same situation now. Since Taliban took over, particularly at the beginning of 2022, we have seen a spike of attacks against Hazaras. Some of those attacks were blamed on ISIS, uh, particularly attacks that happened on the places of education, on the places of worship, and places like that. But then we also see that how Taliban are forcing Hazaras to leave their areas because they're confiscating their lands. Like there is an enforced displacement is happening in Hazara areas, and Taliban are retaking their lands, their properties. We know that the atrocities, including mass killings, are happening in certain parts of Afghanistan where it is Hazara-dominated areas, such as in Daikundi and in Balkhab districts. And then what we also see that the level of restrictions and I would say like the level of restrictions and limitation that they're imposing on the people in Hazara dominated area is much, much higher. And this is also similar to the situation in Panjshir and in Andarab and certain other parts of Afghanistan. So, like access to education, access to health, access to many other services in those areas is absolutely being to non-existence. And even when it comes to the aid delivery, for the humanitarian aid, you would barely see that Taliban would distribute any humanitarian aid in conflict-affected areas where it is dominantly Hazaras or Panjshiris or people from Andarab or other places. So, like, it is not just the discrimination in sense of the political participation, even access to services, access to humanitarian aid, and access to justice has been absolutely to non-existence. Like just few days ago, I had a report that in one of the Taliban intelligence detention center, 480 people are detained. From 480 people, over 400 of them are from Panjshir. And something like just above 70 people, they are from Andarab and from Khost and Fring districts of Baghlan, where the resistance against Taliban is happening. And many of these people, they have nothing to do with resistance. And the reason that you're being arrested, the reason that you're being killed, the reason that you're being tortured, simply because they belong to that area, not because they have been actively participating in anti-Taliban armed resistance. Even people who participate in armed resistance, they don't have the chance to get into a detention. They are just killed on the spot.
I think that's such an important observation that that it's not just about resistance. It's not just about those who are seen as a threat to the government. It's really, or to the Taliban. It's really largely about who you are and where you're from and what you believe.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Because even if you see, like, there wasn't any armed resistance, for example, in Daikundi, there wasn't any armed resistance by Hindus, like, and I think Hindus are the most peaceful citizens of Afghanistan, but then the atrocities that they face and the discrimination that they have faced, the level of persecution they have faced, it is just unimaginable. Like, I can't believe that how someone can turn the situation so unbearable to someone that, the last group of Hindus, they had to leave Afghanistan with their holy book because they all will be killed.
I think when the takeover first happened last year, Afghanistan was the cover of newspapers everywhere around the world, and the main news story, and for a variety of reasons, both in terms of time and the invasion of Ukraine, it has sort of become less of a spotlight issue, unfortunately. In addition to the Hindu highlight that you've just mentioned, are there stories of things happening in Afghanistan that you think are not widely reported by the international community, either in the media or in UN reports, that you think are um, particularly relevant to atrocity risks that should be getting more attention?
Definitely, yeah. I think one of the issues that is happening more and more since Taliban took over is we are every day we are receiving so many cases of femicide. So many women are getting killed, and many of them, they are being somehow said that a woman a woman's body was found here and there in the corners of the city. We didn't see such a thing before. Like, I'm not saying that women were not killed, and even on that time, the majority of women who were killed and executed, it was under the Taliban controlled areas. And now it has increased so much that, like, we have so many reports from different parts of the country, from it's Pashtun area, this is Hazara area, this is Tajik area, but then you see that, you know, the body of a young girl, the body of a young woman, if being recovered, and she was shot dead, and she's unidentified. Some of them, if they are lucky, their identity will be revealed. But for the vast majority, even we don't know who they are, and what were the circumstances that they were killed. This is one of the issues. And second, the level of violence against women and girls, because in the past we had Ministry of Women's Affairs, we had Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, who were systematically recording all the cases of violence against women. And also we had family response units within the police, and we had like a special attorney office for tackling violence against women. Now all those departments, all those institutions have been dissolved and they don't exist. So the only way for us to hear about cases of violence against women is through social media. And this is only when the case gets to the level, for example, if a woman is killed by her husband, by her brother, by her father, by whoever, or if a woman is, being badly beaten up and she ends up in the hospital, and someone in the hospital, maybe a doctor or a nurse, they would just break the news through the social media. So then, other than that, we hear nothing about that, and we don't know. And as much as I heard that so many of these women, when they are facing violence, they have nowhere to go. If they go to the Taliban, they are telling them, yes, your husband, your father, your brother, they are allowed to beat you, they are allowed to treat you like that, because they are your sole owner, they are your sole guardian, and you cannot do anything against them. And unfortunately, you don't hear much about that in the international media or even local media.
It's that dual pressure of the lack of institutions to turn to, and just that they're creating that permissive environment and sort of sending the message that you're allowed to do this against women because that's your role, and also we're not going to punish it.
Absolutely.
I think you've touched on this a few times, the absence of a legal framework now, the fact that in many cases the perpetrators are the people in a place of power, and um, I think you very powerfully said earlier in the conversation, who do we complain to? Who do we turn to for these issues? And I know that particularly given how Afghanistan got to the situation it's in now, the international community doesn't feel like the answer, but to the extent that someone outside of Afghanistan could make a difference, what do you think the international community could do to put in place more robust protection measures for civilians, or even for human rights defenders and journalists?
Well, I think the international community can do several things, Like, first of all, what we really expect from the international community to put more pressure on the Taliban, which unfortunately at the moment we don't see anything. We see lack of consistency, we see mixed messages, we see like one is trying to be tougher and the other is extending a red carpet to the Taliban. So these are like the challenges that we are facing at the moment. And I think what could be done, first of all, I think the international community should pressure the Taliban, and that pressure need to come through putting travel ban on senior members of the Taliban. It should be asset freeze of the senior members of the Taliban, and it should be much more tougher reactions towards this group just by talking and like I would say like condemning or saying something through Twitter. This is not going to solve our problem. This is not going to help us, and the only way that it could change things is when the Taliban are held to account, and that accountability need to come through, tougher sanctions and actions by the international community, including the UN. And second, I think my personal request will be that the international community need to accelerate the process of relocation and resettlement of Afghan human rights defenders and journalists at risk. Uh, Unfortunately, for some of the cases, we have to wait for months and months before even we hear that a visa is being processed or not. A lack of financial resources is another issue. Like, we have tens of human rights defenders at risk in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in different parts of the world, and they are waiting for resettlement. They have nothing really, they are living with nothing. And when it comes to the financial resources, we don't have access to those financial resources to support them. So I think these are like, if I categorize that, it need to be political support, financial support, resettlement support, and more tougher pressure on the Taliban.
Thank you for that. I was going to ask, as a follow up, what different needs populations who are still in Afghanistan have versus those who have been able to leave the country, but obviously still have very specific risks to themselves, wherever they've relocated to, or in terms of thinking about the prospects of someday returning, if the circumstances allowed.
Yeah, I think, for definitely, I think for the ones that already left the country, we have some of the people who are, in the process of resettlement to certain countries. And I think at least some of the countries, they have been very generous in offering the support to Afghan human rights defenders and journalists, such as Canada, Germany, France, and yeah, I think these were among the most generous ones. But then we also have some other countries that have stepped in and supported. But I think, you know given the situation that is happening right now in the country, it is not enough, and more need to be done. So but at the same time, I think for the ones who are inside the country, we also acknowledge that it will not be possible to take out all 35 million people. So many people are starving in Afghanistan. So many women, they lost their jobs. They are the sole breadwinner of their families, and they have nothing to live with. And I think humanitarian assistance, particularly aid that is targeted for women, aid that is given specifically to women, particularly women household heads, That should be also a priority. We don't see much as happening. Like, even if you see the aid distribution by the UN or by the Taliban themselves, it's all men. Like, where are the women? Afghanistan is a country that has been in war for over 42 years. Like, we have hundreds of thousands of widows. We have millions of orphans all over the country. So we're all these population. How we can ensure that access to aid is, it's it is there for these population in need, because especially if women are not allowed to travel without a male chaperone, if women are not allowed to leave their homes, and then with all these restrictions, we are simply not only taking the opportunity of a livelihood from them by the Taliban, but also they have taken away the opportunity of accessing aid.
Absolutely. This is one of the most critical things we talk about when we think about atrocity prevention and the gender dimension of atrocity crimes, is that it's never just thinking about, women as unique victims of specific types of crimes, but also the impact in societies like this where um, the men may have been killed in conflict or no longer around, and women don't have the rights and access to resources anymore.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention. If you'd like more information about the Global Center's work on R2P, mass atrocity prevention, or populations at risk of mass atrocities, visit our website at globalr2p.org and connect with us on Twitter and Facebook at GCR2P.